and thank you for the invitation. Can you see my slides as well? Can I have a sign from someone? Can you see my slides on the screen? Yeah, okay, thank you. So today I will be talking about contested languages, challenges, and opportunities. And I have used the term contested, which I didn't know was going to be trouble for the Turkish translation, but that's actually quite interesting. I have used the term contested specifically in place of endangered languages or in place of minority languages, because some endangered languages are endangered because they're contested, and and not all minority languages are contested. So I will talk a little bit about that. But specifically, I also thought in the case of Laz, this may be quite relevant because of the disagreements around the relationship with Georgia and issues to do with the more socio-political views of language, which I think are part of the problem. So I will talk about that a little bit today. So if we look at, if we go to a search engine and we look for a map of the languages of Europe, very often we get something along the lines of the map you can see on the slide, which is quite puzzling in a way, because there is a very strange, almost one-to-one relation between language and nation states, which is very odd because, of course, nation states are relatively recent, whereas languages have been around for a lot longer. So you might think, well, that's a very interesting coincidence, but it's not a coincidence at all. If you look at a map like, for example, the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, you see a much more linguistically varied situation with 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30 languages per country. So you might wonder what is going on here. Why is there such a mismatch? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And of course, in the UNESCO map or Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, Laz also appears as one of the languages spoken in northern Turkey. And the important thing about the UNESCO Atlas, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is that it is specifically developed on the basis of linguistic criteria as opposed to sociopolitical criteria. Because of course, as soon as you start looking at sociopolitical criteria, you end up with only the major languages involved and very few of the smaller languages. So the UNESCO Atlas, when it started out in the 1990s, at the time it was still called the Red Book of Endangered Languages, and then it sort of developed into the UNESCO Atlas. It specifically set out to use purely linguistic criteria in order to identify languages, so that the sociopolitics is kind of left out as much as possible. And of course, when you do that, you realize that there's a lot more than one language per country. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about why the mismatch. There's a message in Turkish about Chinese. I'm not sure what that is for. Can you still see the slides and hear me? Is that still working? Okay, good, thank you. So why the mismatch between the two maps? And the point is that that's exactly what contested languages are. They're contested in the sense that if you take a linguistic view, you get a certain representation of languages. If you take a socio-political view, you get a different representation, and one that is a lot less friendly to linguistic diversity, which would be the map on the left. Whereas a more linguistic view, you end up with a much more linguistically diverse situation. So in a way, you could say that the map on the left is built almost entirely on socio-political grounds. The official language of France is French, and therefore you get France with French written on it. And then maybe if there are languages that are really, really distantly related to French, like Breton, they might get a mention. But generally speaking, all the Romance languages of France kind of disappear. Similar situation for Italy, similar situation for Germany, where you have, of course, at least two major languages, Hochdeutsch and Plattdeutsch, but you still end up with a very one-dimensional situation, except perhaps for a few small, distantly related languages. Whereas on the right, when you take a purely linguistic view, so you think in terms of grammar and vocabulary and phonology and phonetics and morphology, you don't really worry about what is written in a country's set of legal documents, but you look at it linguistically, you actually see that linguistic diversity is much more common across the world, and even in this particular snippet of Europe. So the reason why there is such a difference between these two maps is that many so-called linguistic maps are actually not linguistic maps at all. They are maps that report the legal and socio-political power of certain languages, as opposed to actually reporting the linguistic situation. And maps like the one on the left, which are socio-politically based, and not just the maps, but more importantly, the policies that those maps represent, have a tendency to make many languages invisible, because you end up with, as I said, a situation where each country has one language and maybe a couple of little dots here and there, but mostly one language, which is of course not true for the vast majority of nation states in the world. It's just sufficient to think that there's about 200 nation states and 7,000 languages in the world. So you can see that there is definitely not a one-to-one relationship between the two. And this attitude towards identifying languages, the attitude represented in the map on the left, which tends to only take into account languages that have a large degree of sociopolitical power, is partly to blame for language endangerment, because of course people are not aware of the existence of many languages. Even people who may be interested in languages look for a map and get a map like this, and they think, oh, it's quite simple. In France they speak French, in Germany they speak German. Yeah, it's quite easy. But that means that these languages are made invisible, and part of the consequence of a language being made invisible is that it becomes endangered. And of course, that is what the UNESCO Atlas is aiming to represent, the endangered languages of the world. And as you have probably noticed, there are different colors depending on the degree of endangerment. Yellow white is the least degree of endangerment, red is the highest degree of endangerment, and black is, as far as I know, as far as we know, if it's in black, it means that there are no longer any speakers, so the language is effectively dead. So you can see that they made quite an effort to not only use purely linguistic criteria to avoid sociopolitical bias, but also to catalog languages on the basis of the degree of endangerment. Well, there's a number of ways in which languages become endangered, but there's a couple of particularly interesting things that tend to happen nowadays. So of course, in previous centuries, languages became endangered often because the population speaking them was exterminated, but now it's certainly for Europe, that doesn't tend to be the reason anymore. There are a lot more political ways in which you make a language endangered without any direct military action, as might have been the case, for example, in Roman times or in medieval times. There's a lot more sociopolitics at work. And what is interesting when you look at language endangerment across the world is that a lot of these sociopolitical techniques are used time and again in different communities and across different language situations. And one of these, which I think is quite popular, but it's an absolute lie, is the idea that languages die naturally. So in my title here, I say it's a popular lie, meaning that it is a lie, and I will explain to you why I think it's a lie, but it's very popular. People tend to think, well, you know, languages die, that's just what happens. You know, language death is natural, just like the death of a person, you know, so it just so happens that, you know, these languages are not doing very well. It's part of nature. And languages, particularly that have a low level of prestige, they just come to a quote unquote natural end. And the reason why this is a lie is because there is nothing natural about forcing languages to lose prestige or forcing languages away from prestige or preventing languages from gaining prestige. There is nothing natural about that. There's a lot of politics going on in the background. For example, in many language situations where the language is endangered, you will see that there were specific policies, media policies, educational policies, aimed at making the speakers feel inferior. Oh, if you speak that language, you are ignorant, you are stupid, you are illiterate. So there was a lot of politics involved in pushing people away from the language. And children, of course, have been routinely bullied, really, by teachers for speaking the wrong mother tongue. You know, if you were a speaker of Provençal in France, or a speaker of Lombard in Italy, or a speaker of Platt in Germany, and I'm sure there are similar examples in Turkey. I know there are similar examples in Greece and in Russia. If you don't speak the language that was decided to be the language of instruction, then you're treated as, you know, some sort of inferior citizen. And this is something that in Galicia, where they have their own struggles with the Galician language, which is closely related to Portuguese, but Galicia is in the west of Spain. They call it linguistic self-hatred. So what's happened is that the school system and the education system has made people feel inferior because they speak the mother tongue that is not the official or the highly prestigious mother tongue. And then they themselves begin to hate their own culture and their own language. And they are the first to say, oh, there is no need to save our language because it's not even a real language. And that brings us to the next step and the next reason why this is a lie, the lie of the natural cycle. Because again, there is nothing natural about making these languages disappear. And another way in which speakers are made to abandon their mother tongue is that they are taught to read and write only in the majority language, and they end up believing that their language cannot be written down or is inappropriate for writing, or it cannot be used for writing. There is something wrong with the language that it cannot be written, or even it's just impossible to write it down. Again, of course, no language is impossible to write down. Every language in the world, including the major languages of the world, were first spoken languages, and writing came much, much later. So it is normal for every language to have first of all a spoken version. What is different here is that there is a sense in which people are made to feel that their language is inferior and cannot be used in writing. So you can see that when languages start to be used less and less and therefore become endangered, there is nothing natural about this cycle. There is actually a lot of policy and educational policy and official attitudes against those languages that pushes them towards this endangerment. And of course, parents are often under pressure from the institutions and from the educational system to stop speaking their mother tongue to their children, with the idea that if you want to do something good for your child, don't speak your mother tongue to your child, speak this other language, which is the official language, which of course makes the children feel negatively towards their mother tongue and their parents' mother tongue, and also takes away the opportunity that bilingualism and multilingualism can give to children. Here are some specific examples of how there is nothing natural about languages being used less and less and then eventually being endangered. In fact, there is a lot of, as I said, of political will to make these languages endangered. This is a sign from a French school in the early 20th century. I believe it's from a Provençal area. And you can see that the sign says, speak French and be clean. So if you want to be a good pupil, you wash yourself in the morning and you speak French. And then, of course, we are surprised if these children abandoned Provençal or Breton. Well, of course, we're not surprised. They were pushed to do that. Here is another example that is well known in Wales. This is known as the Welsh knot. I don't know if you have ever heard of this. It was used in Welsh schools in the 19th century and up to, in some schools, up to the beginning of the 20th century. It's basically a piece of wood with a string, and the piece of wood had the words Welsh knot or WN written on it. And when children were going to school and they were forced to speak English, but of course, Welsh was their first language, so a lot of the children spoke Welsh. What the teacher would do would put the Welsh knot around the neck of the first child heard speaking Welsh. And that child was then told, if you want to get rid of the knot, you go around the school, and if you hear another child speaking Welsh, you can pass the knot over to that child. At the end of the day, the child who had the knot around their neck would be punished. So again, Welsh wasn't abandoned because language death is natural. Welsh was abandoned because people were forced to abandon it. Here is another example from France, and this is specifically from Breton, and specifically the sign says, it is forbidden to spit on the floor and to speak Breton. Well, in fact, the other way around, to speak Breton and spit on the floor. So you can see that speaking Breton is considered as bad as spitting on the floor, right? So don't spit, don't speak Breton, and you'll be fine. Again, another sign of how languages don't die naturally. They are driven out of society. This is another sad example, but very telling of the situations. This is the Sigit tribe, which is a tribe native of the Pacific coast of North America, so Canada and some bits of the US, specifically Alaska. And some time ago, a group of anthropologists went into this tribe because they were interested in the language. And they gathered a few people from the tribe and started speaking to them about their language. And what these anthropologists noticed is that the people of the tribe tended to speak English and they refused to speak Singit. And this went on for a while until at some point, one of the anthropologists asked one of the elders, do you speak the language? And the elder said, yes. so why do you not speak it with me? I want to hear your language. And the answer was, whenever I sing it, I can still taste the soap, because in school, they were made to wash their mouths with soap whenever they spoke the language. So you can see, these are quite chilling examples and maybe a little bit extreme examples, but they show you how language is becoming endangered and eventually losing speakers have nothing to do with nature and a lot to do with politics and forcing people away from their languages. Just checking how I'm doing for time. I think I'm okay. And although today you don't tend to see such extreme cases, you do see cases where languages are forbidden in certain contexts or are pushed out of certain contexts, even though maybe not as in extreme a manner as we saw right now. But there are a couple of examples, for example, from Italy, not long ago in 2005, so we are not talking about the 19th century here. A secondary school in Naples decided to fine pupils who were caught speaking Neapolitan. And quite interestingly, about 100 years after the Welsh Knot, the pupils were also encouraged to report each other. So turn the pupils against each other for speaking their mother tongue. Of course, they weren't speaking Neapolitan, out of a coincidence. They were speaking Neapolitan because that was their first language. In 2009, in Venice, a fishmonger labeled his produce in Venetian, and the local authority fined him over €1,000 because the law says that you can only label produce in Italian. Again, this is not as extreme as the cases we saw earlier, but this is also 100 years later. And you can see there are a lot of policies still aimed at pushing certain languages away from certain contexts. And this second example in particular is quite similar to what used to be known as the commerce law that were developed against the use of Catalan in commerce. This is during the Franco's rules. So during the Franco's government in Spain. And of course, the idea was that if you keep a language out of commerce, then the language is less prestigious. Therefore, low prestige and endangerment were forced on the language. It wasn't something that just fell from the sky. Okay, another popular lie is to do with languages and God. And this is also something that was very popular in previous centuries, but I would like to argue it has a modern version. The modern version doesn't tend to be related to God, but it does the same job. So first, I'll explain what the original version was. So there was this belief that some languages can only be used in what we linguists call low context. So they can only be used to talk among friends, in family, at home. If you are working in a farm, they can only be used to do that. And the reason why I brought up God is because one famous quote is that in these languages you can speak with God, so you can pray and ask for forgiveness, but you cannot speak of God. You cannot speak about God, because of course, if you want to speak about God, it has to be Arabic or Latin or ancient Greek. The idea being that only some languages can do that job. And of course, we know that is not true, because Arabic or Latin or Greek, the vocabulary those languages have developed didn't start from nothing. There was an actual political and social attempt at developing that vocabulary. No language starts with the basic vocabulary for religion. Languages start with basic vocabulary for sustaining everyday life. more complex philosophical, religious, and scientific vocabulary develops after decades of work and of deliberate development. So this is a lie that you can't do it. The idea is that people were pushed not to do it. And you can see a lot of examples. This is from the 17th century. A common and a holy manner of speech are contrary, that only is holy which is separated to God from common use. So the idea being you need to distance yourself from God, and therefore you mustn't use the common words. You have to have special vocabulary that only some languages have. And some of these arguments were used against the idea that you could translate a Bible into English, which of course we all know is possible, and there are lots of Bibles translated into English to prove it. But at the time, the idea was, oh no, you can't speak of God in English. It has to be Latin or ancient Greek. We're talking about the Western God here, of course, but you see very similar cases within the Muslim faith when you look at Arabic. So the situation is not that different. The languages are different, but the situation is very similar. Another example, when you speak of God, put more difference between God and man than between a king and the smallest worm. So the idea being, do not use the language of everyday speech. You must use a language that is totally different. So you might be wondering, okay, but this was the 17th century. Why are you talking to me about the 17th century? Well, because there is a modern version of it. We are told that some languages are not good for the media, are not good for education, are not good for business, etc., etc. And this is very much the same idea, although in a different context. And this is where the other popular lie I was talking about resides. When we are told that, oh no, in order for education to happen, you have to use Spanish, German, Turkish, French, whatever. You cannot use Provençal or Catalan or Plat or Laz, for example. Then we are told a lie very similar to the one that we were told about. You cannot translate the Bible into English. It's exactly the same story. We are told not to use these languages in situations that would make them be perceived as stronger languages. So in a way, this is a way in which the languages are kept weak by being excluded from this context. And of course, this comes at a price, because being excluded from this context is a symptom of language endangerment. There's a question in the chat. I will take questions in about 15 minutes. I'm going to keep this under an hour so I can get some questions. Not because I don't want to answer it, but because I only saw it now and I'm not sure what it related to. So hold the question in memory and we'll address it later. So as I was saying, languages being excluded from this context is actually a big symptom of how these languages are made to become endangered. And that's because the UNESCO language vitality paper, which is one of the most important pieces of literature we have in order to measure how well a language is doing, mentions that official status and use and trends in existing domains are actually important ways to measure if a language is endangered or not. There are others, as you can see, there are other little white dots there, but I would like to focus on those two in particular because they are related to what I was talking about. So if a language has official status, it tends to be stronger in society. And if it is stronger in society, parents are more likely to pass it on to their children. And people from outside the society are more likely to know about it. So official status and use is not just so that we can say my language is official. It's not just for that. It actually has consequences on the use of the language. if there are specific policies in favor of a language, and there are attitudes that governments have positively towards the language, that increases the use of the language. Vice versa, if there are explicit policies that are negative, or even no policies at all, as Fishman once said, no policy is negative policy, because if you have no policy in favor of a language, you're just letting it die without any help. And if there are negative policies or no policies or negative attitudes from institutions towards the language, the use of the language will decrease, because people start to feel that the language is useless, is not important, it's an obstacle. And so official status is actually an important symptom, or the lack of official status is an important symptom of how a language is doing. Also, which domains the language is used, which contexts the language is used, is also an important symptom of whether the language is doing well or not. So where, with whom, and the range of topics for which a language is used directly affects whether or not it will be transmitted to the next generation. So when we are told, oh, don't use this language in school, oh, that language is not good for the media, or that language can't be used in business, we are told to reduce the topics that we speak about in our language. And that affects the transmission negatively, because people lose confidence in the language and feel that passing it on to the children is a bad idea. And of course, that's how a language dies. Doesn't matter how many speakers you have. If it's not passed on to the next generation, sooner or later, people have a habit of dying. So if you don't pass it on to the new generation, you're not going to maintain the language. Which is why, so these are the challenges, and now we're going to have a quick look at the opportunities. Because just as we have seen that the lack of these things has a negative effect on a language, the reverse is also true. The presence of these things, the presence of broader language domains, of better official status, or more topics of discussion and so on, that is also, if that is present, then the language is more likely to be maintained, which means that we can do something to encourage the maintenance of the language. And that's what has been happening throughout Europe, and not just Europe, but I'm going to focus on Europe because that's the area I have more expertise in, with various attempts at increasing the status of the language and widening the domains of use. So widening the topics in which the language is used. One important operation that has happened in several situations and started off from Catalonia, but has been expanded in other areas, is what Pompeu Fabra called normalization, making the language normal again. And what that means is making it normal for the language to be used with everyone. Don't just use it with the elderly. Don't just use it to speak to your family. Use it in more contexts. Of course, it's no longer normal to do that because the language is endangered and society tells us that it's not good for this topic. But that's exactly the point of normalization, to try and regain those topics that the language has lost. Another way to increase the range of topics, of course, is to use it with children and to develop literature for children. And in more advanced cases, like here in Wales, BBC Cymru, which is the branch of the BBC that broadcasts in Welsh, and this is BBC Cymru Ffydd, which is BBC Wales Live. So the programs are live, but there's also regular radio. And of course, that is not something that was always true. This is something for which the Welsh have fought for many years. But starting from the late 1970s, where Welsh began to have a presence in the media, and now it has a strong presence in the media. Starting from the 90s, the presence became a lot stronger. But it's something that was quite an achievement in the 1970s to have Welsh on radio waves. Schooling, of course, is another important part. This is an example, Skoldiwan, which is a group of schools in Brittany through the medium of Breton. It is a non-for-profit organization, and it's mostly volunteers to teach certain groups of children through the medium of Breton. And that doesn't just make children learn the language, it also increases the use and the prestige of the language, of course, because once a language is in a school, it gains prestige. And then you have cases like in Wales, where the schooling system is quite strongly bilingual, as you can see from the bilingual sign. And I guess signage is also important. You know, of course, bilingual signs don't save a language, but they send a message that the language is there. It exists, and we are proud of it, and it's okay to use it, which is all important in the full development and strengthening of a language, which is what we need to do if we want to reduce its endangerment. So I hope I've given you a few ideas and a few things to think about, and I'm very happy to take questions from this point forward. There was a question earlier from Yüksel asking, when did this happen? Can you clarify what you mean by this? Because unfortunately, I didn't see the question in time. Thank you. In the meantime, are there any other questions or anything else that you would like me to give you more details on? Are you all being very shy, or is it my audio that doesn't work?
Ya ben bir şey sorabilir miyim? Sesim geliyor mu acaba? Seblan. Bu bir kitapta okumuştum. İngilizler İskoçya'da işte Keltçe konuşan çocukların diline biber sürüyorlarmış. Bu kitabı yazan da biber sürülmüş çocuğun birisiydi. Bir çocuk yazmıştı bunu. Hala işte o dili, Keltçe ana dilini konuştuğum zaman ağzıma biber tadı geliyor diye. Şimdiki anlatımda sabun örneğini verdi. O daha ilginç tabii. Gerçekten bu biber olayı olmuş mudur acaba?
Yes. I don't know that story in particular. No, I mean, the Welsh knot is very, very well known here. I wasn't aware of that. I wouldn't be surprised, but I wasn't aware of it. Yeah, but it wouldn't surprise me because a lot of those things were happening in a lot of schools. Yeah, it's just that the Welsh knot got a lot of attention, so everyone knows about it. Yeah.